Hi everyone, thanks for clicking on this video. I'm Bob Paulinski, Master of Wine. Today's video is about the world's most widely planted wine grape variety, Cabernet Sauvignon. I'm going to discuss a bit of the history of this grape variety. I'm going to talk about where it's grown in various places around the world, the type of styles that you can expect. I'm also going to get into some classic food and wine pairings with Cabernet Sauvignon. And then the video is going to conclude with a comparative tasting of 3 different Cabernet Sauvignons from different places around the world at different quality levels, ranging anywhere from $7 to $170 per bottle. There's going to be some narrative on the wine style and the difference in terms of quality and what drives the price difference. And then I'm going to provide some practical shopping information that you can use when you're out looking for these wines. In terms of its place in winemaking history, Cabernet Sauvignon is a relative newbie on the wine scene. It has origins that tie back to the Bordelais area in France, but those origins only began in the 18th century. Now, through some DNA testing done through UC Davis in the 1990s, it was established that Cabernet Sauvignon is actually the love child of Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. Cabernet Sauvignon is grown in the majority of wine-producing countries around the world. Now, why is that? There's a few reasons. For one, it's a versatile grape variety. It can take to different types of soils without a whole lot of hassle. Also, it's quite adaptive in terms of climatic conditions, but preferring areas that are a bit warmer. In addition, it's a high-yielding grape variety, or at least it has the potential to, while still retaining a good amount of varietal character. And the other piece, which you just can't ignore, is in many places around the world, Cabernet Sauvignon has a strong consumer demand, and that's oftentimes going to drive its production. Another factor that plays to the advantage of Cabernet Sauvignon is its French origins. In this case, it ties back to Bordeaux, perhaps the best known wine region in the entire world. So in that regard, I would say perhaps Cabernet Sauvignon has a bit of a silver spoon in its mouth. It does have a competitive advantage. Also, French grape varieties, to a large extent, have driven much of the activity within the wine world. Specific to Cabernet Sauvignon, it has a track record for excellent quality, also very good longevity as well. And in recent decades, there have been events that have driven the popularity of Cabernet Sauvignon from high to even much higher. Think back to the 1970s, there was an event called the Judgment of Paris that pitted several up-and-coming California producers against very well-established, reputable French producers. French judges in that competition chose the California wines as superior in both Chardonnay and Cabernet. That elevated the position of Cabernet even higher. In more recent years, the demand for Cabernet Sauvignon, specifically from Asian markets, has just been through the roof. There's a high value on deeply extracted, dense, very full-bodied wines. It's exactly what Cabernet Sauvignon delivers, and it's certainly benefited from that as well. Now, within the range of the most prominent players of Cabernet Sauvignon, France certainly does top that list. Bordeaux is the big driver, but also some of the surrounding areas in Western France do grow a fair amount of Cabernet Sauvignon. You'll find it in some other places around the country as well. Certainly does have a strong presence down in the south in the Languedoc. Within Chile, Chile is one of the world's largest producers of Cabernet Sauvignon, everywhere from opening price point to very ultra premium as well. Within the US, and certainly California is a big player, but Washington State is growing very quickly. Also, some other states like Texas, for instance, has a fairly strong presence of Cabernet Sauvignon. In addition, you look at places like Australia with McLaren Vale and Barossa, Coonawarra. Some of the most iconic places within Australia make a strong presence with Cabernet Sauvignon. Within Argentina, it certainly does have a strong presence as well. Within Central and Eastern Europe, it's a big player. Surprisingly, there is a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon grown in China, and that number is growing very quickly. So if you combine all of the acreage of Cabernet Sauvignon around the world, it's around 850,000 acres. That number is just slightly smaller than the landmass for the state of Rhode Island, to give you some comparison. Now, there are some places around the world where Cabernet Sauvignon really is a bit player at best. Certainly within a couple of countries that very much embrace indigenous grape varieties like Portugal and this country of Georgia, Cabernet Sauvignon is really not a major player there. And then there's other areas where the limitation is really based more on climate. Areas like Austria, Switzerland, and Germany really don't play much with Cab Sauv. And then if you take a country like New Zealand, for instance, relatively cool growing area, but you will find a small amount of it grown in the North Island in the Hawke's Bay area. Just a few comments about the growing of the grape variety itself. Cabernet Sauvignon tends to bud late in the spring, and it's generally a late ripener going late into the fall. What that means is in some marginal areas in the springtime where there may be some frost, in many cases, because the grape variety buds late, it's protected from that frost to some degree. In terms of the grape clusters, they tend to be very small. Most of the time, if you're out in a vineyard around harvest time, a cluster of Cabernet Sauvignon will easily fit within the palm of your hand. The berries are small, like the tip of your pinky. They tend to be fairly tough, thick-skinned grape varieties. If it's grown in a bit of a cooler area, you're going to get more of a herbaceous note. You may get a bit of that bell peppery character and some red fruit notes. In warmer growing areas where the sugar levels are higher, the wines tend to be broader, lusher, a little more body to them, a little more weight, with more darker fruit character. So what sorts of wines does Cabernet Sauvignon produce? Now, I've touched on it a bit, but the range is actually quite broad. The gold standard, that which is most emulated, is certainly the Bordeaux from the left bank, which are the ones that are Cabernet Sauvignon driven. These are perhaps the most copied wine styles anywhere in the world. Now, when you have Cabernet Sauvignon that is showing its best potential, the color is going to be quite deep. If you recall, the grape skins are quite thick and the berries are small. What that's going to lead to is a lot of extraction of color, a lot of deep fruit characteristics in terms of that flavor profile. Also, you'll find the acidity is going to be quite high. The tannin's also going to be quite high, which is going to lend to the longevity of the wine. Within its home base of Bordeaux, Cabernet Sauvignon is rarely bottled as an individual solo grape variety. Oftentimes, it's going to be blended with Merlot, Cabernet Franc, perhaps a little bit of Malbec or Petit Verdot. And what these other grape varieties provide is complexity. They round out the wine. They make it more complete. You'll also find in other places, New World places around the world, in California, for instance, if a wine is labeled as Cabernet Sauvignon, legally it must only be 75% of that grape variety. The other 25%, the blending options can be whatever they choose it to be. In many other places around the world, the threshold is set at 85%. Now, the role of Cabernet Sauvignon will vary based on the place of origin and the particular wine style. In some cases, Cabernet Sauvignon plays very much a dominant role within a wine. In other places, it plays much more of a supporting role. For instance, in the right bank in Bordeaux, in a place like Saint-Emilion, for example, oftentimes Cabernet Sauvignon will be used in smaller amounts versus Merlot or even Cabernet Franc. In a place like Ribera del Duero in Spain, again, Cabernet Sauvignon plays a bit of a supporting role. It gives the wines a little more heft, a little more weight, a little more range. There's also some examples in Tuscany, for instance. It's used in some of the super Tuscans where I think some of those wines can be absolutely amazing. But then there's also other examples like Chianti Classico. In recent years, small amounts of Cabernet have been approved to be used there. In my opinion, producers who use small amounts of Cabernet Sauvignon in Chianti Classico just absolutely lose their sense of place. And in my opinion, it's not a good fit in that particular situation. There's a couple of other noteworthy points about Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a grape variety that has a fantastic affinity to being aged in oak. And what that oak will provide is a whole other level of complexity and range to the wine. Virtually every premium Cabernet Sauvignon is going to get some sort of oak regimen. Sometimes it can be as long as 2 years as being aged in oak barrels, some cases even more than that. But that oak aging is going to show itself by lending a smoky charred character into the wine. Sometimes you'll detect something that's reminiscent of vanilla. It can also show as clove, nutmeg, coconut, cinnamon characteristics. These are all subtle things that can be brought into the wine to bring added levels of complexity. Also, Cabernet Sauvignon is one of the grape varieties that on occasion will show a sign of pyrazine. And pyrazine is a naturally occurring compound. Oftentimes, it's tied to vineyards where perhaps the fruit is not fully ripe. In some cases, maybe the yields have been a bit high. Sometimes it can actually be a result of some mismanagement out in the vineyard. But if it's managed in a proper way, it can add a level of complexity to the wine. If it's overbearing, it's not going to be an attribute. But in terms of blind tasting and identifying Cabernet Sauvignon, pyrazine is one of those markers. There's only a few grape varieties that on occasion will show that characteristic. Also, just a quick passing comment, on occasion, Cabernet Sauvignon can be the source for some very good rosé. In terms of food and wine pairing, Cabernet Sauvignon and red meat is a classic matchup, whether it be beef or lamb-based dishes. Because Cabernet Sauvignon has a relatively high level of tannin, that tannin will cut through the fat in a red meat dish and it'll leave the palate clean. If you had something like a ribeye steak, for instance, quite fatty, Cabernet Sauvignon would be a perfect match with that. I also think it actually does quite well with many tomato-based dishes. It may not be my first choice, but in a pinch, I think it works quite well. What it does not work well with are dishes that have some spicy heat to them. Because of the tannin levels are quite high, the tannin will actually accentuate the heat, so I wouldn't suggest it for that. For many, the rock star matchup is Cabernet Sauvignon and bittersweet chocolate. I'm not going to argue the fact. I know there's a lot of fans out there. It's not my thing, but I think maybe I'm in the minority in that case. But in terms of the actual wine glass that I use with Cabernet Sauvignon, I like a glass like this. I like one that does not have a huge bowl to it, something commonly used for Pinot Noir. What I find is with a glass like this, it really does funnel all the aromatics to a fairly small opening at the top. That chimney effect really does bring out the best of Cab Sauv. So this is the type of glass that I use for most Cabernet Sauvignon-based wines. Well, now we're ready to launch into the wine tasting. There are 3 wines that are going to be tried. I've already poured the first one. It's a 2019 Bodega Norton Collection Cabernet Sauvignon from Argentina. This producer has been around for a long time, great reputation. Certainly solid wines at more of an opening price point, but they do make some higher end wines as well. You notice that there's a screw cap. The back label indicates an alcohol level of 13.5. With Cabernet Sauvignon, if you're finding alcohol levels in that 12.5, 13 range, generally look at those as being lighter, fresher, brighter styles. Oftentimes they're going to have more of that red fruit characteristic. When the alcohol levels tick up to that 14.5 range or so, you're going to get lusher, broader, jammier style. So this one's a little bit more on that lower end. The color of the wine is just medium deep. It's certainly not opaque, but it has good color extraction. There is a bit of fade as you get out to the rim. Aromatics have that definite whiff of pyrazine. There I'm getting that bell peppery character. There's a little bit of that red fruit note underneath as well. Maybe a little bit of oak, but if it is, it's minimal. I mean, maybe it's kissed a toothpick, but certainly not much oak in this wine. And on the palate, very simple, direct style. Medium weight, not a lot of length to it. Falls off on the back palate. The tannins are relatively soft. This is what you would commonly find for Cabernet Sauvignon made for a broad market. It's clean, fresh, bright, simple, made for near-term consumption. This is a wine to be drank now. At this point, I'm moving on to wine number 2, and I expect this wine to be very different than the first example. This one's from Australia. It's a 2020 Jim Brand Silent Partner Coonawarra Cabernet Sauvignon. Coonawarra is one of the most classic places for Cabernet Sauvignon. Has a very distinctive character. You'll find wines that have a bit of a eucalyptus note. It's a region that has a very long growing season. And what that means is the fruit gets full physiological ripeness. There's a softness, a refinement to the wines. I expect that to be shown in this wine. This one is currently not being sold in the US, but it will be on the back half of the year at about a $40 retail. It is currently being sold in a handful of export markets. As is the case with many premium Australian wines, it does have a screw cap. I notice on the back label the alcohol level is 14.5. I would expect this wine to have much more weight and heft versus the first. Now, in terms of the appearance, this wine has much more color density than the previous wine. Not quite opaque at the core, but certainly more depth of color. As you get out to the rim, there's a bit of fade, but not much. This is obviously a very youthful wine. Aromatics, completely different than wine one. This does not have that whiff of pyrazine. The fruit is much riper. There's a blackberry and there is a sage note to it, along with a good amount of oak. And the oak has that smoky charred character, along with a little hint of eucalyptus as well. Aromatics have a lot of intensity. It's broad, it's weight, it's quite expansive. Even though the alcohol level is 14.5, this wine shows no sign of alcoholic heat. On the palate, there's a lot of volume, carries right through the back palate, very round, has this subtlety, this roundness, the polished character, which is so typical of Coonawarra. The tannins are evident, but they're very soft and well integrated, as is the level of oak as well. Beautiful bottle of wine. It's drinking great now. It's also going to have some length to it. A wine like this, I think, could easily keep another 6 to 8 years. This is what you'll find in premium Coonawarra Cabernet. Moving on to the third and final wine, I expect this to be a very different story than the previous two. This one is from Napa Valley. This is C. Elizabeth Cabernet Sauvignon from Oakville. It's actually a single vineyard wine, a place called Game Farm Vineyard. Very small production. I don't expect you to find this out in the market, but again, this is more for illustrative purposes. Small production, only 10 barrels. You're looking at about 300 bottles per barrel. This is 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, alcohol level of 14.8%. Now, with Cabernet Sauvignon, it is sold at a premium today, and there's a lot of reasons that that's the case. I mean, for one, close proximity to Silicon Valley, close proximity to San Francisco. It's certainly a very strong tourist area, but the other driver is the amount of expansion that can happen with the vineyards in Napa is basically nil. It's really been capped out at where it's at. So the demand is very high, the supply is quite constrained, and that's going to lead to very high prices. This particular wine sells for about $170. I expect this wine to be quite different than the first two examples. Looking at the color of it, it's quite deep. And there is a bit of fade as you get out to the rim, so it is showing some signs of maturation. In terms of the aromatics, very different than the first two. This does not show any of the pyrazine note. It has none of the eucalyptus character. This has a lot of black fruit, blackberry sort of notes to it. There's a good amount of oak. There's a slight clove characteristic to this wine as well. Certainly a big, dense style. The alcohol at 14.8 might lead you to believe that there might be some alcoholic heat on the nose. There's really not. The structure of this wine can support the alcohol quite well. On the palate, very broad, very weighty, extends to the back palate, soft tannins, good integration of oak. The back label shows 30% new oak, American oak, which oftentimes has a bit of a sweeter, almost a coconut characteristic to it. It shows that 70% of the oak is second year use. So there is some obvious oak here, but it's not over the top. A wine that has a lot of length, a lot of richness and weight. This was open just a few minutes before tasting. I'm curious to see how this shows a little later this evening when it gets a bit of air. I think this could develop a bit more nuance and character, but a really solid example of Napa, of something that's just a bit down the street from where I live. There was a lot of ground to cover on this video. Thank you for staying to the end of it. If you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. Hit the like button, also comment down below. All of these things would be much appreciated. I try to follow up on each and every comment, by the way. I'm going to be drinking something really nice tonight. There's no doubt about that. I hope you are too. I hope to see you again before too long. Cheers.